Today I'm speaking with a wonderful lady who has a platform called Untestimony. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
And you are on Instagram and TikTok, is that correct?
Yep.
I have seen a bunch of your stuff on Instagram. I've not checked out too much on TikTok, but is it correct that on that page your goal is to really, in part, just expose some of the really big ideas that helped you as you were processing it?
Exactly. It's kind of like a personal diary. I touch upon the ideas of like kind of close family members or my past beliefs, the ideas kind of that affect me most in my day to day still. Because I live in the Midwest where it's like still very Christian.
Mm.
So, and then also like a lot of people don't even really know what atheists believe. So, a really big part of my page is to kind of like humanize atheists and kind of like let people know we exist. Um,
That's
and
awesome.
yeah.
And you're married and you're a graphic designer, is that right?
Yep.
Cool. And that's all I know about you so far. I know we're about to dig into your story, but before we do, could you tell us anything else about yourself that we should know?
Yeah, I love I'm a big art person. I love doing like felting, digital painting. I also love like climbing and I've been getting more into lifting lately. Um I've been like transitioning into a vegan diet, which is like a really big part of like kind of my morals and my atheism had to do a lot with that shift. Um But yeah, I also love playing Nintendo games. You can probably find me playing like Switch all the time.
Yeah, I can see there in the background. Very cool. Who are those characters, by the way, on the table?
Um, so this is like Brewster from Animal Crossing who runs the coffee shop, and then little Chow from Sonic. I don't know if you've ever played Sonic. And then this is from Kirby.
Gotcha. I'm a little bit. I'm dating myself here. That I'm from I guess at least a generation or half a generation earlier. But I was more in the Pac-Man, King Kong, Donkey Kong. I remember
Yeah.
my brother playing Mario Brothers and all that a lot. So I saw that it was getting big. It's amazing that just how it's evolving, and I look forward to seeing how the whole metaverse takes over some of that fun stuff. Well, I did want to give you the floor to tell us about your story. I have read enough of your uh, posts and seen enough of your short clips of your videos that you do to know that you have done some really deep digging into a lot of topics that are very crucial to the beliefs that people have, and to the point where if people honestly looked at your stuff and they said, wow, she's got a point here, and this is a good point, that's a good point, they would actually be finding themselves deconstructing a little bit, wouldn't they?
My goal is to push people to ask the hard questions because I never really had anyone giving help. I never had anyone when you're so indoctrinated into like just constantly hearing those Christian answers that are kind of like the subpar, they don't really cover the whole answer, but it sounds sufficient when you hear someone challenge, like give a response to those questions. That kind of helps a lot.
It's amazing too when you really look at your background, which I want to start here in a second, but when you look at your background, someone like yourself, this has been a hard journey, and I wanted to start there and then give you the floor. But this has been a hard journey, hasn't it? To talk to these things kind of in your own mind and think through it. This has not been easy for you, has it?
Yeah, for a long time, like I had this narrative that I was like the wolf in sheep's clothing. And this was
Mhm.
while I was still a Christian. Um, I was still going to Bible studies and like church for a while into being an atheist. And I was not ready to like lose my community. I wasn't ready. Christianity was my whole culture, the language that I use on a day-to-day basis, like my whole family, my closest friends are all Christian. So
Mm.
um I wasn't ready to lose that, and I felt guilty for not believing or for like sitting in on the Bible studies and disagreeing or like not wanting to contribute because I didn't agree, but not knowing how to kind of navigate that. So I remember like crying to my brother one night and saying I was just the wolf. Like I felt like the wolf. Like I kind of like gaslit myself into thinking that I was this monster, because I had this view that atheists were like, it kind of goes along with how Christianity teaches people to view like unbelievers as they're willfully making this decision, when you can't choose what you believe, you can't choose what you desire. So it taught me to look at myself as if I was like doing this terrible thing, when in reality I was seeking truth more than I ever had. I was frantically knocking and the door wasn't being opened, and I was kind of putting that back on myself as if it was my fault that God wasn't answering. So then that kind of led to this like feeling of abandonment, like
Mm.
God is not here in this time of when I'm looking for him more than I ever have, and the world is kind of collapsing around me. And yeah, so I internalized all that. And then
Mm.
as I became an atheist, I think I found a lot of healing from that narrative of like the wolf in sheep's clothing. And I actually got a tattoo that is a sheep in wolf's clothing, kind of to flip that narrative. Like, this person that I was telling myself I was, like, no, like Christianity, that's my background, that's my culture, that's still who I am, even though I'm an atheist. It's like something that's really meaningful to me.
Yeah. Well, I definitely want to return to that point in time that you're talking about. Can you take us back to the starting point? Is it correct that you grew up in a Christian home?
Yeah, so my dad was a pastor. I grew up going to church multiple times a week, super invested in youth group.
What denomination was that?
It was just non-denominational. My dad was raised like Baptist, so it was kind of Baptist influence, but technically we called ourselves non-denominational.
Mhm.
Um, and then I would like in youth group, I would like lead Bible studies. I taught Sunday school. Um, and then later on, my dad transitioned into working for Caleb, and then he worked for Answers in Genesis later on. But that was like most of my growing up, he was a pastor.
Mm. Was your church the kind where they would do altar calls and invite people to come forward and trust
Um,
Christ, or how did they do that?
Sometimes, but not as often as I've heard it's done at other places.
Mhm. What was the earliest time you remember being invited to place your trust in Christ as your Savior?
So I remember when I was around 4, I I think I was starting to think about like death, or I remember fearing death and thinking I don't want to go to hell, and going to my mom and asking like how do I not go to hell? And she kind of taught me like, oh, you just like pray to Jesus. He basically like uh told me the whole like ABC: admit, believe, choose, and taught me how to like pray to Jesus to accept that gift. And so I remember like going and praying in front of my dollhouse, that Jesus would accept me. But I was 4, so, and it's funny because I actually do have like a distinct memory of doing that, but I didn't grasp what was happening. And then later on, like fast forward to when I was 11, and I decided that I wanted to start reading the Bible every single day. Um, and I think that was more of like the moment of when I was like actually choosing for myself, um, and actually grasping it and actually like committing. Um,
Did you have an actual memory of like saying, "God, if I didn't do it the first time, I'm going to do it for real this time. This is
yeah,
definitely."
yeah.
Mm.
And then that was when I started really making like Christianity my identity, instead of just like sitting around being bored in church. After I started reading the Bible every day, with I think that was what made it into like that made it into something very meaningful for me. And that kind of changed the way that I, like, from that moment forward, then I started trying to get involved in like youth group more and stuff like that.
Hmm. When you were growing up, what did they teach you about the Bible? Did they say it
Um,
was like perfect and from God, or was there any kind of
yeah,
balance there as to how to interpret it?
I was taught that the Bible was inerrant, the inerrant word of God. Um, it's interesting because I look at it as a more fundamentalist view now, but at the time I didn't think it was like fundamentalist at all.
Mm.
Um, it was very much like a complementarianism view of like with like gender roles and
And I assume coming from a Baptist background that you all had more of a literalist interpretation, meaning Adam and Eve were real, the Garden of Eden was real, the flood was real, and it was probably 6 to 10,000 years ago.
I believed in young earth creationism until like out of college. And that was one of the things that first spurred me on into deconstructing.
Mm, interesting. I know you mentioned before your dad worked for Answers in Genesis, which that's like the creation museum before the Ark Encounter was created. Was when you were looking at that, seeing your dad's involvement and just the people that you came in touch with in those circles, was there a sense of we're fighting a battle against, like, either for sure the world, but even liberal Christians, like we have the truth and we have to fight a good fight to tell people this is the truth. Otherwise, if you don't believe this, like if you don't believe in Genesis 1:1, then why would you believe the rest of it? Was that kind of the background?
Yeah. And I think there's even some quote from Ken Ham that's like, this is if the Bible, if like the flood didn't happen or like Adam and Eve, if the earth isn't like 6,000 years old, then like how can we even trust the rest of the Bible? Something along those lines. So then those like you got, yeah, those pesky evolutionists, you have to combat them and really they're it's so interesting because there was such a view that like scientists were, I don't think I would have said that they're outright like conniving or anything, but there was kind of this like underlying view of like, well, they're really biased towards their own agenda. But it wasn't like, it was very much a, everyone has their biases. And so instead of like looking at them and realizing, oh, well, about 95% of scientists like oh, believe in evolution, um, who all come from different backgrounds, worldviews, like, and then there's like the less than 5% of young earth creationists. And it's like, who's really biased here if like the 95% all come from like really similar, or I mean, a wide variety of views and stuff. Um,
Yeah, that's a good point.
and it was very much saying like, it was very much like, well, they're bad too, instead of just saying, well, instead of like giving a reason why like young earth creationists weren't bad, it was kind of just saying, well, they're bad too.
Yeah, exactly. When you were growing up, what was the message like about sin and wickedness and punishment? Do you remember any sermons or messages about that topic?
So it's funny because my dad always had this analogy that he would say, like, this isn't a cruise ship, this is a rescue operation. Um, like, and kind of go into about how like original sin and how like we're all deserving of hell, we're all deserving of eternal punishment, but because Jesus like came and he died for our sins, he gave us the opportunity to take that like free gift and um, like gain salvation and like worship God forever, and to be with him forever. um, but if people weren't hearing this message, how could they receive it? So it was kind of this like frantic, like, we have to tell people because they're not going to hear it. And I I even thought like babies weren't saved, and like remote tribes in like like other countries, like I thought they wouldn't be saved because they hadn't heard. So like that kind of spurred me on into wanting to go into like missions.
Yeah. Were you taught that like babies go to heaven right away, or would some babies be in danger of going to hell?
I was never explicitly, it's really interesting because I think my dad didn't touch upon hell as much as he like emphasized heaven, and like um because apart from like the whole rescue operation mentality, um in hindsight, like I didn't have as um I think we didn't touch upon hell as much, so it didn't like resonate with me. But I was never explicitly told that like babies weren't saved, but I think I just like kind of came to that conclusion on
Yeah.
my own because I don't know, I didn't think about it or something.
Yeah, it's kind of like a mixture of they're not at the age of accountability, and there's it just doesn't seem fair for a baby to burn in hell. And King David's, when his son died, he said, I can't, he can't come to me, but I will go to him, meaning like I'll see him someday again. And there's definitely ways that Christians try to explain that. And I remember it coming from me really to a strong, interesting point when I eventually, my theology moved to more of a Calvinism before I deconverted, and I was going to a church here in Atlanta, just outside Atlanta, called Perimeter Church. It's a pretty big Presbyterian church, and the pastor who'd founded it, and he's been there for decades. He was preaching, and it's one of the last maybe 20 sermons, last couple times I was there in the church before my deconversion kind of kicked up, and eventually I was like gone. And this wasn't part of my deconversion, but it was interesting, kind of parting shot from the Christians. But I remember him talking about counseling a woman whose baby had died, and how she was traumatized, and it was horrible. And he was telling the congregation, like, I had to tell this woman the most important biblical truth possible about what happened for her to get biblically grounded in and process this correctly. He said, the truth, ma'am, is your baby deserved to die. Biblically, everybody's born a sinner, and sin deserves death. And I remember at the time, to my shame, thinking, theologically, I think that's correct. I don't know if I would have said it to someone's face, especially someone grieving, but I think that's correct. A baby is born, a child of Adam, and deserving to die. And that was just, the whole thing is crazy. And you mentioned too the missions thing. Did you ever hear anybody say the opposite in terms of going, like the passionate drive to go do missions, where they might say, you know what, God's going to judge them in their ignorance right now because they don't know Jesus yet. They've not heard about it. They may not even have a Bible in their language. They're, in their ignorance, going to have a lesser judgment because God's just going to base his judgment on what they do know. Meaning, did they look up at night and say, there must be a creator, there must be a designer, I want to know him, I want to find out, what to do to be right with him. But the minute that you actually proclaim Jesus, the real provision, at that point they have a crossroads, they have a watershed moment. You need to make a decision. Are you going to follow Jesus or not? And at that point they might actually be worse off, because now the greater knowledge deserves greater judgment. Now that they know what to do, if they choose to reject it, they're going to go to hell for sure. Whereas before it might have been like, well, as long as they're pursuing God in some way, maybe God will be lenient. Did you ever hear that kind of line of thinking presented to you? And like, why go do missions? Because you may make it worse.
Yeah, it's so funny. I went to a private a private Baptist Christian university, and one of the messages that they were like super adamant about was telling people kind of along those lines, like if we went to tell people, or if we went and told people about Jesus and then them hearing it, or if they would be at risk of hell for us like going and sharing the gospel with them, then sharing the gospel would be the worst thing we could possibly do. So that doesn't make sense. So their position that they would teach was people are just automatically going to go to hell. So we have to share it with them.
Gotcha.
So
Make more
that,
sense of the Great Commission.
yeah.
Hmm. Did you, with that in mind, did you either then in that context or in any other, did you think about the fairness issue? Like, did it seem fair to you, or did that not come up at all?
I fell on the end that you were kind of talking about, where like God knows their heart. I think I didn't necessarily think they would be saved. I think I thought that God maybe left them in that remote area because he knew that they wouldn't even accept his message if they had heard it. I think that was like where I stood, but I hadn't pieced all the puzzle pieces together. Like, I think if I had, that would have caused a lot of cognitive dissonance to accept that these were like real humans that like might be suffering just because they were born in the wrong place at the wrong time.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's interesting how you said, not putting the pieces together. I remember little pieces that arguably I could have put together, like when I would occasionally hear about some Christian pastor who would say something like, in the end, nobody's going to burn in hell. God's going to save everybody. And I remember thinking, of course, as a good Calvinist and a good biblical literalist, of course, hell no. There is a hell, and that's the reason, you're not, God's not going to save everybody. Number one, if he was going to save everybody, then why are we going out and preaching? He's going to do it anyway. But number two, that's the whole point, is that sin deserves death. Sin deserves punishment, and the soul that sins, it must die. And the whole idea shocked me, to like, how can a preacher actually think that, even entertain such a thought? And yet on this side, I'm thinking, how can any human entertain the idea of a quote unquote good God letting people be eternally tormented in a burning fire, whether it's the literal burning fire that I grew up with, and you probably did too, or the kind of the C.S. Lewis version where you just kind of cave in on yourself and become self-absorbed and kind of have your own little personal hell, the great divorce kind of concept. Whatever version of it you have, like, it's some kind of personal torture for you. And the idea that God would be okay with that forever and ever and ever for the people that were supposedly his children. I never put the pieces together, and it's amazing looking at it from this side. You're like, why couldn't I have seen that? And it's a good testimony to the effectiveness of brainwashing. I mean, it does a good job, a real good job.
Yeah, even like stories of the flood, or in the Old Testament where like God basically like tells people how to like, if you suspect your wife is cheating, like make this potion basically and she'll have a miscarriage if she was unfaithful. Like,
Yep.
I remember someone bringing that up to me and thinking, well, it's God. Like, that's different than us having an abortion. Like, God can, or like the genocides, like, God can do these things, but that doesn't mean we can. And it's interesting how detached I was from, kind of like you're saying. I don't think I was grasping the severity, and those things aren't even close to eternal suffering, like eternal damnation.
Yeah.
So I don't even know how I was so removed, because now, like, that's one of the reasons I feel like I have so much more empathy as an atheist, is because like those things like horrify me now, and it horrifies me that I was okay with those things just because an authority figure said it was okay.
Mm. Did you deal with to the issue of the teaching, the preachment, so to speak, of, look, your awareness of sin and compared to the white hot holiness of God is so deficient. You can't understand God's ways, not just in terms of his wisdom and his plan and his artistic, mathematical genius of what he's doing through time and creation, but you just can't understand the difference between your lack of holiness and his complete utter holiness. And there's no way that you could ever say, God, it's not fair that you commanded genocide, because you just you and I, as humans, we can't understand the fairness issue, because we are not, in that sense, equipped to understand it, because he is the actual definition of right and wrong. He is the judge, um, among other things. And if he says these people deserve to die, that baby deserves to die, genocide is acceptable, all these things, then you have to simply bow your knee. It's like will the thing formed say to the creator, why did you make me this way? Will you literally shake your fist as an ant at, your, the human above you? It's not going to work out so well, just in the sense of the differentiation between power and how big he is and wise he is compared to us, but also just the whole idea of you don't see sin as it really is. If you saw sin as the wicked thing it really was, just the awfulness of it. I like to think about like the worst horror movie that you really like. If you see it, you're thinking, oh, I shouldn't have watched that. That really kind of shook me up. That was too much for my spirit. Like the worst horror movie that disturbs you afterwards and disturbs you that you actually chose to watch it. That sin is so much more disturbing than that. And if you understood the reality of that, you wouldn't be telling God he has no right to judge sin. You'd be praising him. You'd be saying, God, thank you for being a judge who actually takes sin seriously and punishes these awful things, even including using forms of punishment that we would, as in our humanists, be concerned about, like genocide. Did that kind of come across your mind at all as you were thinking through it?
Because it's like, who are we to question the God of the universe? Like,
Yeah.
God, sure, he did these things, but it was for a greater good. And so I think that's one of the reasons why biblical inerrancy played such a big part in my deconstruction.
Mm.
Because then it turned into, I'm not questioning God, I'm questioning what a fallible man tells me about God. And so I think that was a crucial piece to like my whole deconversion story, because I would have never gotten past that. Um, I would have never gotten past that otherwise.
I definitely want to dig into that here in a few minutes. In terms of going back a little bit to your upbringing, what did you believe about things like the way to be saved? You mentioned that you gave your life to Christ when you were 4, and then again at 11. Could you, for anyone that's like not sure about what that would look like, what does it mean to give your life to Christ or to believe in the gospel? Like, what are the details behind that? What did you actually do and say in that time,
Yeah.
especially the later one?
Yeah. So because humans are all born like fallen, we humans have this sin nature. No matter, and sin was defined as like missing the mark. So basically, God's original design, his perfect, beautiful design, humans strayed from that. And so, and I believed in original sin. So, like Adam and Eve eating from the tree, and then the fall happening. And so then God gave us these laws to live this better life. Um,
When you
but
say original sin, you mean that it passes down. So just the fact that you're born means you're condemned, right?
yeah. Um, and so then Jesus gave us like the 10 commandments and these laws. But as fallen humans, we could never uphold them. So God had to send Jesus down to die for us, to live after living this perfect life. Only he was able to really bring atonement to that corruption or that evil. And because of that, now we can all receive the free gift of eternal life with him and worshiping God in heaven forever.
And so when you were actually placing your faith in that, it's sort of like you're swapping your sin and judgment for Jesus's death and resurrection and his righteousness, being applied to you, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Hmm. It's amazing to think about this, but did it ever hit you the whole idea of how much blood is talked about in the Bible, both Old and New, but just the idea of like when I deconverted, the whole phrase blood magic began to come on the horizon quite a bit. And if you had asked me as a Christian or made a claim like you believe in blood magic, what is that about? That's weird. I would have said it's not blood magic. But then when I eventually deconverted, I was like, yeah, actually it actually is. It's really weird. You get things that you're like, no, you're twisting it, and then you get out, you're like, no, that's actually correct. Did it ever hit you the weirdness, not just the idea that God that a God would need blood. But the idea that he couldn't just forgive you without blood, like even if blood were somehow special, which it isn't, but even if it were, he couldn't just say, you know what, I just forgive you. I don't need blood. I'm there's no special ritual that has to happen. I just forgive you. Did it ever hit you that the weirdness of the blood magic part of it?
I think I saw that his to me, the reasoning was always, it's not that he had to do it this way, it's more of a sign for us because we would never be able to grasp the severity of sin without like sacrificing these animals and doing all this stuff. So it was more of like a symbol or a sign for us so that we could grasp something that otherwise would have been really abstract, and it kind of put it in a more concrete, tangible form. Um, which now that I'm like vegan, and the thought of using animals as props or humans as props is horrible to me. And now I think I grasp, I think now I have a more similar view to that like blood magic thing where it feels like some sort of like witchcraft or just any other religion you would see, that I was so indoctrinated that I did not think it was like in any shape or form odd or creepy. But now I look at it and like communion, sacrificing animals, all this sacrifice. It's definitely looks different looking back.
I love that you mentioned communion or the Lord's table, the Eucharist. It's when I was growing up, one of the kind of the worst ideas of people you could be is someone who was either what was known as a pagan, or at least you were shady enough that you were kind of collaborating with people that you would have called pagans. The idea, I mean, you were obviously not worshiping Christ, but you're kind of worldly. You're maybe into crystals, or you're into witchcraft or witchcraft kind of movies. God forbid, so to speak, you're watching Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and just the weirdness of this paganism. And then when you get out of Christianity, you realize that the ancient Egyptians, who we would have, of course, called ancient pagans, they were into blood magic, they were into circumcision, they were into a pork taboo, and that out of Egypt, the Jewish people came, and of course they did what they were used to from Egypt. They brought their religion with them, and you get all the way up to like the Lord's table, and you have them saying stuff like, "I want you to eat my flesh and drink my blood." And when it hits you, it's those memes or pictures where like it says on the bottom, like when it hits you and you have to like you realize there's something hidden, you have to stare at it for a while, and then you like see it like, oh wow, yeah, that changes the whole picture. It's like when you see it about Christianity, like, oh, wow, this was an ancient version of paganism that I was sucked into. I was just as pagan as if I was into Egyptian paganism, as if I was worshiping Ra or one of those other Egyptian gods. Like, this was not something different. This was just a different version of the
Yeah.
same exact thing.
Yeah, and it's so funny because in one of my classes where I was studying the world religions with like through a Christian lens, like Christians were teaching the class, so it was still a little iffy, but um, the leaders were talking about either like Hinduism or something. They were telling one of the origin stories of how the world came to be, and some of the other students in my class kind of like snickered and were kind of laughing at like, this is so far-fetched. And even as a Christian, I was taken aback at, I guess, the disrespect, because I was thinking, if somebody who didn't know the story of Adam and Eve, like if somebody who didn't know the story of Adam and Eve heard our story out of context, like they might think it sounds similar. And it's so funny I had those thoughts because I was completely bought into that the story really happened and everything, and I couldn't quite match up that it was like a myth in the same way somehow.
Yeah, that's a great point, and it's amazing when you go through that and you realize there's some of the other religions still sound really silly, but ours just doesn't sound right anymore. It's like ours is just as silly as theirs is. And if they're going to believe in, this happened because of this elephant and that thing, it's like, well, yeah, but you have angels in heaven who, know the white hot holiness of God, and they know how wonderful it is, and yet they're going to come down and leave, and they're going to mate with humans, and they're going to create giants, and there's going to be angels with swords in the garden, and it's like it's a serpent. You're like, this is crazy, and donkeys that talk, snakes that talk, the magic Urim and Thummim rocks from the high priest, like you mentioned, the magic dust water for the women to see if they're faithful or not to their husbands, and you get to a point where you kind of shudder. I mean, honestly, when I went through it, you shudder to realize what you were in, and we would have, as Christians, always said the cults are so bad. Jehovah's Witnesses, holy smokes, they're just into some nasty stuff. And then when it hits you, like, I was into some nasty, nasty stuff. I was into, in my verbiage, a human sacrifice death cult focused on blood magic and scapegoating. And again, when you're in it, you'd never say it that way. When you're out of it, you're like, that's what it was. Did it ever
And
hit you that, I'm sorry, again?
oh, well, I was gonna say, and they'll say it all comes back to faith. Like you'll kind of question it and like say, well, that kind of sounds like a myth. Like how, I don't know. And they'll say, well, just have faith. But they don't apply that same standard of evidence to other religions. So that was like another key point why I consider myself an atheist, not because like I just want to stop having faith in Christianity, but based on the standard of evidence that I'm going by, in order to be consistent, I would have to apply that same thing to like other religions too. So it became this like, if I put faith in Christianity, I would also have to, like, which religion is it? There has to be a reason that makes this religion stand out from the other religions, because they can't all be right. So then it kind of just made it start to collapse.
That's awesome. I love how you're putting that. It's kind of like it's the opposite of the whole C.S. Lewis garbage about this is the one true myth. Like everything else is a mythology. This religion had a virgin birth. It had a young boy going to the religious people around age 12, talking to people. This other guy was baptized. He went up to the desert immediately and got tempted by the devil. He started his ministry around age 30. All this stuff, it's like the same stuff, and then you come to Jesus and he does the same things, or even some of the individual stories, like Hermes walks across the water on his golden slippers to help people, and Jesus walks across the water to help the people in the boat, and you keep on finding parallels that are like some of them are too close to the point where they're even quoting some of the Greek mythology, word for word, especially with the Dionysius stuff with I'm the true vine and all that, and turning water into wine, and you get to a point where you're like, this is the same thing, and then you get the people again like C.S. Lewis and all that saying, well, this is the one true myth, and eventually you do what you just said, like you realize the cognitive dissonance behind that. Like, no, you can't claim that this is the one true myth. This is just another myth.
Yeah, or like the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is dated earlier than the flood story. And so it's like, by the standard a lot of Christians go by, like, if the earlier story is more accurate because it was closer to the event, then technically that should be the more accurate version of the story. Even though I don't agree with that standard. I think it can still be like a myth. But
Yeah.
I think there's not a lot of consistency all the time when they're like looking at these different stories.
Yeah, for sure. And there seems to be a lack of willingness to admit that these things keep on evolving. Like you mentioned Gilgamesh, the Utnapishtim team in Noah connection. But it goes on and on. Even I've been reading recently about Enoch, which is kind of a pet project of mine. One of the things that really shook me up was realizing that the New Testament quotes the book of Enoch well over 100 times, which I never, I went to Bible college. No one ever told me about Enoch. I just was completely oblivious to what Enoch was about. But then realizing that the book of Enoch, which is a huge part of the theology behind the New Testament and the Gospels and the book of Revelation, when you realize that what Enoch was, the book of Enoch was heavily copied and redacted from a very similar Sumerian story. And you're like, these things just keep on changing. They just keep on taking older stories, shifting it to, because of a new political and theological construct, they're just changing the story. But it doesn't make it true just because they're retelling old stories. It just means they're retelling old stories in a new way. And some of it's copied, some of it's just influence and kind of a tentative or a loose borrowing, but they're trying to take somebody else's story and either refresh it or react to it. And that's all that this has ever been, is just people changing other people's stories. And I wish when I was in Bible college, especially, that they would at least put that on the table. It wasn't even like it was on the table and they defended it. They just didn't even put it on the table. They did not talk about comparative mythology or the Greco-Roman mystery cults or all these other, Greek, even all the ways that the New Testament extensively copies from the book of the Iliad and the Odyssey from Homer. They just don't even tell you about it. And it's like, come on. If you want to defend it, fine, but at least tell me first where it looks like this stuff came from. Did you get much of a comparative mythology background before your deconversion started?
Not at all. And it's really interesting because I think I didn't realize how many of those stories were out there. And so I only knew of like a few stories, like, oh, there's like the virgin birth narrative in a few different cultures, without realizing like, no, we can like trace like history back and see the story being told for like a really long time. Like I was almost under the impression that like Christianity influenced all those narratives rather than the other way around.
Right.
And I think a really good resource to look for like to learn more about cultures in that way and to see overlap in those narratives is like art history textbooks or going to an art museum, because then you can see actual concrete artifacts that I think it sounds very like abstract and like, well, how do we know people believed this? But if you go and like look at some of those like artifacts and stuff, and like they can date those artifacts and like it goes way back, and it's really interesting to see that in a more concrete form.
Interesting. I love that too, and especially I love recently been digging into like Egyptian art, like stuff that's not even you have to go to the actual temple at Karnak or whatever to see it, to walk into the actual structure. But some of that stuff you can see even parallels between ancient Egyptian art and Christianity and Judaism. It's mind blowing. Before we go into your deconversion, I just wanted to go into a couple more topics, kind of your pre-deconversion timeframe. When you grow up in a Baptist group, especially, I would imagine the whole idea of purity culture, modesty culture, virginity culture, shame culture, and probably another word or two I'm missing in there, it all kind of merges together. Was that part of your background? And if so, what did that look like in your particular church and group?
So it was very much I think there was very much there was an emphasis on men being these very sexual creatures and not being able to control themselves. And then like women on the flip side, it was more of like, that's not even really a thing. Like you're not sexual at all. And so like polar opposites. I remember reading this devotional that was like, women want love, men want sex, and thinking in my head like, or yeah, and it also said like men want respect, but then like women just want love. They don't really like want sex. It's just love. And I remember thinking in my head like, well, I want respect and I like am a like sexual person, like, so it really confused me. And I think it caused a lot of damage because it put this narrative in my head that like my husband is always going to want other women, and it's like my job it's my job to keep him from wanting other women. And so like that's something that I still have to work through, and it's like purity culture stuff has caused like like it's been the hardest for our marriage. But yeah, I won't get into it too much.
That's an interesting point. I hadn't thought about it that way before. I don't think the whole idea of that your husband's always going to be tempted by other women, and kind of like, I guess the implication would be like, if you're a godly woman, you're going to kind of keep him interested in yourself to protect his purity. So, you're going to be whatever, either sexually available at home, or if you're, if your modesty culture in terms of your dress allows that you would dress a little bit sexy to always catch his eye first, whatever it is, but to be always cognizant of his needs. And there certainly is a good sense mixed in there, I guess, that I wouldn't want to discount of, like, it's important for people to want to meet each other's needs and to be there to help each other to have really good sexual and erotic experience in their marriage. But the whole idea of, like, you're responsible if he flees, or if he strays, I should say, that's a really interesting thought.
And the
I
hardest
can't
part,
imagine.
yeah, and the hardest part of that is it didn't teach. Not only did it teach me that if he cheats, it's kind of like because he like just wasn't into me, I wasn't good enough. But it's also like, even if he stays with me, even if he's with me, he's always gonna want to look at other women. He's always gonna want to be with other people. He's only with me to fight temptation. Like, there's the verse where Paul talks about, like, get married to avoid lust, and like if
Yeah, it's better to marry than to burn, kind of stuff.
yeah, so it's kind of like put this narrative in my mind that's like, even if he's not technically cheating on me, he will always want to. And that has caused like that has caused a lot of religious trauma, and probably the only religious trauma that I have is probably from purity culture stuff.
Hmm, interesting. It's funny too that what you're describing, though, because there's an interesting paradox with that and the earlier side in life where you're probably, at least for sure before you're married, the idea of being almost non-sexual, in the sense of not wanting to tempt your brothers in Christ, so to speak, because if you're turning their heads intentionally, I mean, some men, their heads are going to turn no matter what you do, but if you turn their heads intentionally just because you chose to pick that dress versus the more conservative one or whatever, um, you have different choices to make about your dress and the way you handle yourself that could be a stumbling block. And was there an encouragement to really be modest with your dress when you
Yeah,
were before your marriage?
I didn't wear like leggings and stuff until out of college. And there was always there was always a lot of pressure on me to for that. And then I think I felt guilty too, because if I like I didn't even I was pretty reserved like high school throughout college, and I'm trying to think of how to word this. I never really explored my sexuality going like through high school to college, and that's caused a lot of issues like in our marriage. And I was always taught that if you stay pure and if you do things right, it'll work out perfectly. And my biggest regret is not exploring my sexuality. And people say like, oh, it only takes communication and then you can figure things out with your partner. But there are so many factors like differing libidos, different sexual orientations, different, and in order to communicate, also both partners have to be willing to communicate. And I feel like communication is a learned skill. And how can you learn to communicate about sex if you've like never been taught about it at all? You don't know anything about it. You don't know anything about your body. How can you communicate that to your partner who also
Yeah.
doesn't know their body? So it's just this weird thing where I never thought in a million years that not exploring my sexuality and actually doing things right would have like just left me way worse off than if I had just had a good time.
Yeah,
And
interesting
you have to
paradox.
carefully, because there are like you have to do it carefully because there is risk associated with sex, and you have to do it safely and with consent and all that to take into account. But that said, I do wish like I would have been less hard on myself growing up.
Yeah. That's a really good point too, from the guy's perspective of it, is that guys always felt kind of like what you said, there's like this understanding that guys are very sexually driven, and that needs to be kind of ground one. Like everyone is, ladies need to understand guys are going to be always kind of on, always ready for it. But there was also from a guy's sense this constant message of you guys need to, if you're serious about the Lord, that is, you need to be really controlling yourself to the point that you focus much, much more on the gospel, on the Bible, on heaven, on eternal things. If you're going to think about sex, it obviously needs to be very strictly in the context of wanting to be using it to exemplify the commitment and the unity that Christ has with his church, with his bride, and that there is a beautiful relationship there that you're exemplifying. And you end up trying to kind of put religion into sex on so many levels. And for guys who are constantly just thinking about, look, their eyes turn and they feel like, oh, I shouldn't have looked. I definitely shouldn't have looked twice. There's this message that kind of is implied of you guys are pretty bad. You're pretty like nasty. You're not taking your passions and putting them under the lordship of Christ. You are not bowing the knee to Christ in the area of sex. And especially when you come up with topics such as, masturbation, self-pleasuring, you talk about topics like pornography. The message is just, in so many ways, you are bad, 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 bad. And it's an interesting paradox where you have this theological message of you are perfected in Christ. You have been declared righteous, and God is making you righteous, and someday he will completely make you righteous in reality. And God's Spirit is moving in you, and God no longer looks at you with the message of, I hate the sin in you, we're at enmity. He looks at you only as, you're my beloved son, just like I love Jesus because you're in Jesus. I love you now too. You've got his covering, and you feel like God loves me so much, and yet you also feel like God's so disappointed in me. And I liken it to like a parent relationship where if a parent's just constantly saying to the kids, you know what, I technically love you, but boy, you disappoint me every single minute of the day. I mean, that's eventually that's going to come back to bite you. You can say you love them as much as you want on the technical side, but if you keep on actively, practically telling people, man, you just messed up again, you are such a loser. Like, why can't you get yourself together? Keep your mind out of that gutter. Guys feel like they're constantly set up to fail, and it's just such a weird paradox. And I'm glad you're bringing up the points you are too. And I think with bringing the guy's perspective too, the whole thing is like this toxic mixture where you are absolutely set up to fail, whether you're a guy or a girl, and it's really heartbreaking, especially for the people that on top of that struggle, which we all faced. If you actually did something wrong and it became like you got the scarlet letter, where all of a sudden all the struggles that everyone's dealing with get compounded with, you actually got pregnant at 16 or something like that. And some girls, have that where they're just like, wow, I guess I've truly messed up my life because I did this, as opposed to, like you said, they were exploring their sexuality. There may have been some better choices they could have made along the way, but they're not doing anything wrong.
Going back to what you were saying about like kind of all that pressure that's put on like men too, like I have multiple guys in my life who I knew they didn't tell me this until like after deconstructing and a long time later, but like they struggled with self-harm from every time they would think a lustful thought or something, because of like verses like you should pluck out your eye rather than like looking at a woman with lust, or I think there's some verses that Paul might talk about this, but I could be wrong. But so like a couple different guys that I know like would poke themselves with a pencil like really hard every time they would like think a thought. So it's just like
a self-flagellation kind of deal.
Yeah, like the execution of that. And you can say like, oh well, Jesus didn't mean it literally, but that just is that's like spiritual bypassing that just completely glazes over the fact that a lot of people genuinely internalize those like kind of general concepts of like it's not like they're taking it literally. They just really want to live a good life and like be pursuing God, and that leads to this kind of like unnecessary infliction of pain, or kind of an ascetic lifestyle to make sure you're not putting any idols above Jesus, or something that's really that I've been thinking about a lot lately is you don't want there's such an emphasis on like don't dwell in sin because your heart could get hardened. But then that line of like where to cross it is kind of vague, so you don't even want to get close to the line. But then that causes people to really back up like way far away from that line, because they don't the point of no return, in order to avoid like your heart getting hardened, you don't want to go into that point of no return where the stakes are so high you could get damned to eternal suffering. So therefore you like back up really far from that line not to cross it. And it leads people to do these really severe things, like whether that's like poking themselves with a pencil, or breaking up with a boyfriend so that they don't have any idols before God, or just getting rid of like CDs or random things that might be worldly. You have to pick up your cross and sacrifice things. It kind of causes this unnecessary ascetic lifestyle for some people.
A great point, and it really testifies to the idea that some of this toxic stuff we're talking about creates a double world for people, where they end up having like this side where they're honest with themselves. In some sense, they're ashamed of themselves, but they're honest. Where they're like, I want to think about certain things, or I want to, be dwelling on this. And then for their front-facing world, where they're like, I want to be a good Christian, they have to be either denying that they're like that, or thinking about certain things. And you end up with people with two different worlds. And I don't want to equate them necessarily, but like you see these stories with that Duggar boy with what he did, and other people, where you see this context where they're kind of creating this pressure chamber, like, look really, really good, don't look, don't think, don't dwell on any of those things. And on the facade, it's like, okay, yes, I'm the good guy, I've got the suit and jacket and tie, and I'm an upstanding guy, and of course I'm doing everything right. But you know that for a lot of these guys, they're going back, so to speak, either, I'm saying this metaphorically, but even literally, they're going back to their closet and masturbate into porn. And it's like, is that really the way you want, where you got people living these separate lives? And one of the things too that's bizarre to me, and I'll wrap this up shortly because I want to get on to the rest of your story, but the whole idea of just the beauty of the body. And I didn't plan on per se going down this route, but since we're talking about it, the idea of how to see the actual body. We as guys especially, and I'm sure girls struggle with this too, but as Christians, but you're kind of seeing the body as a constant source of temptation. Like, if you were able to see what you kind of want to see, but you shouldn't see, but if you could see it all, you would just be this ravenous wolf, kind of thing. And I remember as I began to kind of think through some of these issues, I did two things. Number one, I was working on a book for a book about the body, about the way that we think about the body. And I took some classes to become what's called a certified lactation counselor. It wasn't because I wanted to actually do that. I don't think many women would have been interested in my 2 cents on how to breastfeed their babies, but it was part of the book, it was part of research, and I took some classes and got actually certified as a lactation counselor. And you go through it, and you end up realizing that, as you're talking about all these topics about how breast milk works for the baby, how like a baby, for example, could get sick, and the mother literally like gets sick too with the baby, and her breast milk changes to give the baby what it needs to get over it. And you begin to be just very used to the idea of thinking about and seeing and talking about a woman's breasts, and it kind of loses its power. And then I remember at one point I went, ironically, with a church group to a missions trip in the Dominican Republic, and at the very last couple of days, we kind of took a day or two to kind of have a downtime and went to a beach, which ironically was a topless beach. And I remember seeing a whole bunch of topless women there and thinking, like, this isn't what I thought it was. It's kind of beautiful. It's beautiful to see this. And then I remember eventually actually going to a nudist camp quite a few times, and looking around and thinking, like, guys, when you're in church, even something as simple as like, oh, I saw a woman's like whole big chunk of a woman's bra strap showing, or her nipples were poking through her shirt because it was cold or whatever. And I'm thinking at the time as a Christian, oh, that's just good. It's such a stumbling block. It's so like I'm gonna, go masturbate over that. And then when you actually get to a point where you start to deconstruct that and think the body is just beautiful as it is, you begin to stop letting it have its power over you. You begin to see it more like living like art, like the body, men and women, they're beautiful. And you stop trying to see it all as meat to avoid, because if you look at the meat the wrong way, it's going to, tempt you too much. You just begin to reprogram your mind and think, what are we doing to ourselves? And I remember thinking, this is just crazy the way that we twist our perspective on the body, and not just in terms of other people's bodies, but even ourselves. Like we kind of in a sense hate our own bodies as Christians.
And I think there's even been studies done where they show in cultures where like topless is normal or like more skin is revealed, versus cultures where like the women are covered head to toe. Women are more sexualized in the cultures where they're covered head to toe,
Yeah,
which is a really interesting concept, but
yeah.
it's not normalized, I guess. But yeah.
It's like the more it's a secret, the more the erotic drive, yeah. And yet at the same point, the more the duplicity of people living two separate lives. Well, moving on back to your story, I wanted to kind of wrap up your time in Christianity. Could you tell me about just what it was like to live a life as a Christian, especially as a teenager, where you were having quiet time with God, where you're praying? Like, what was your life like with God in the good moments? And do you remember ever kind of hearing God's voice or sensing Him moving? Did you see any miracles? What was it like to actually like sense God in your life?
So when I was 11 and like made that decision to start reading the Bible every day, I felt super connected with God. And I, even in high school, I would get to school early and I would read my Bible like a chapter every morning before I went into school. And
So like to start the day off right, kind of
yeah,
thing.
and I would pray regularly. I When I had like a breakup in high school, like that was what like helped keep me going, and get me through that. I loved reading like the Psalms because I felt I felt like I connected to it felt like God heard me in my times of like sorrow.
Yeah.
So the Psalms specifically really resonated with me. And then I also like loved worship. I remember a time when I would like sit in worship services and like not feel connected, but then like kind of later on in life, like going into high school and like after I'd started like reading the Bible regularly and stuff, I felt like a lot more connected. Um, yeah.
Was there ever pressure on you to become a missionary or to do some kind of missions work, or any kind of even church work?
I think it was more of just a pressure I put on myself. But really kind of I think I think it came really from myself due to like having empathy for people and um kind of like I mentioned, like my dad always emphasized like this is a rescue operation. We're trying to like save souls. And the stakes were really high. So I wouldn't have felt okay with myself to think people are going to hell and not try to do everything I could to keep people from going to hell. Like I think I kind of placed that responsibility on myself.
Did you ever actually hear the message like their blood is on your hands if you don't do something?
It was more of, I think it was more of a more Calvinist ish perspective where it was like the blood wasn't on my hands, but because of the Great Commission, like God still wants to use us as like a part of that plan, and we can still kind of play a part. I don't think I really put that weight on myself fully though.
Yeah. We I definitely didn't put it on myself either later as a Calvinist, but earlier with more of a Baptist background like yourself, there was a sense of like kind of like if you were seeing someone in a burning house and maybe a small child screaming, and there was clearly a way for you to get in and get out and get that kid out of the house without you being even hurt yourself. Clearly a way for you to get in and get out, and they're screaming there at the window, and you can tell just by you're taking 5 seconds of assessment of the fire from what maybe of a house that you've been in before. That you've got about a good 30 seconds to get in and get out before you would get even scathed, and it would take you about 10 seconds to actually rescue the child. So you have a big margin of error. You could get in and get out, and instead of doing it, you just keep walking. Like how horrible would it be to do such a thing? And it's like you're kind of responsible. It's not like you didn't actually choose for them to go to hell, but the fact that you could have done something, and you didn't, it kind of puts the burden on you. And also the sense that like there was like this mystery of the Spirit's always working, and you just never know what the Spirit might use. It might be that you hand a gospel tract to somebody. Maybe they're the kind of person that would read it, and maybe 100 other people would never read it. They just put it in the trash. But that one person that gets that tract, they'd be the person to read it. Or maybe if you forwarded them with some kind of book or video or something, that's somehow the message that they would get. So you're constantly looking for like a path to figure out what does that person need to be able to receive it. Like they're so blinded, and they're so blocked off from the Spirit of God and is moving, but there's some cracks in the wall. What is it, and what can I do? And maybe the word that I speak today, or maybe if I invite that person to church, maybe my pastor will get through to them in a way that I never could. And I remember just thinking always, you got to do what you can. And did you ever hear that example, the starfish on the beach?
Mm-mm.
It was the idea of like 1,000 or 100,000 starfish have washed up on the beach, and the sun's coming up, and it's going to dry them out, and they're all going to die because it's going to get too hot, and they can't get back to the water quick enough. And so this guy's walking, and he's countless starfish that are all about to dry up, and as he's walking on the beach in the morning, he's throwing them back in the water, just tossing them, and somebody notices and says, like, you realize you're never going to get them all back in. You're making no difference. There's just too many. There's way too many. And the guy that's doing it says, yeah, but to the one that got back in the water, it makes a world of difference to them, matters to them. And so it's always this sense of do what you can, because also from the flip side, it could have been you. What if you were that person in the house? Wouldn't you have wanted someone to come rescue you? And that the pressure is just enormous, especially when you put the context of hell there.
Or like another analogy is like you might be just planting the seed, and then someone else might come along later and water the seed, and then somebody else like eventually down the road is going to harvest the seed. And even though you're not the one to harvest the seed, like every little bit helps, which kind of goes along with the other analogy that you were giving.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah, Paul Waters, Apollos, does this next step. Well, in terms of the church thing, I want to go back to for 1 second to the church experience. You mentioned worship. Did you ever, during the time of being a Christian, when you were in church, did you ever feel like it was manipulative in church in terms of people's emotions?
Yeah, and it's really interesting because I had kind of an aha moment while I was in one of those missions classes where they were teaching us about the other religions, and they were teaching us how to reach other cultures. So one of the ways that we were taught to do this was through harp music. I don't know if you've heard of the concept of like harp music, but
Yeah.
so they basically harp music is the music that like resonates the most with each individual's like emotions, and a lot of times people's heart music will be the music that they listen to most during their like really formative years, or music that they listen to during a really emotional or intense time in their life, and they'll kind of like link that music back with this, or like the music from their culture that they grew up with can also like be their heart music. And it kind of varies from person to person, but for me, I would consider my heart music like just normal Christian worship music, because that's kind of what I was like raised on, and like maybe K-Love radio stuff. And I always loved it. I know a lot of people like don't like Christian music, but for me that resonated with me so deeply. And then you might go to some other culture across the world where they like will bang on drums, or they showed us some clip of this tribe where they would like lay in a canoe, and then the rest of the tribe would like beat it with sticks, and they would all be getting super emotional. And to our culture that just sounded kind of like just noise, maybe even stressful, but to them that was like a really moving ceremony. So then that's all to say, they kind of taught us, when you are going to try to reach other people, if you're going to be doing like missions in a different country or something, it doesn't make sense to do your own heart music. If you want to reach people, you want to do the music that resonates with them the most. You want to kind of like go along with like their culture. And I remember having this moment thinking to myself, isn't that kind of manipulative? Like, it's kind of just using the music that causes an emotional reaction to make them feel connected to this thing that they may or may not be connected to. But yeah, that was a really interesting concept to me that they were teaching us to actively do.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I've heard of making sure that you're like teaching tribal people in their heart language, but I had not heard about heart music. It's, I mean, if it kind of follows, like don't obviously speak to them in a different language or in a trade language. Speak to them in their heart language, and heart music would follow. Yeah, that's interesting. Did you, when you think about that with, in your, you know, American upbringing, when you weave that realization in with the manipulation maybe of people who are desperate, do you feel like, looking back on it now, maybe not as much while you were in it, but looking back on it, do you feel like there was a sense of ever people preying on the needy, like you're downtrodden, life's not going so well, so come to Christ, he'll either fix your situation or he'll fix you, so you don't feel as hurt or neglected, or um, you know, like you're just going to feel like God's going to wrap you up in his arms and he's going to restore the years the locusts have eaten. He'll make things good again. You know, he'll bless you.
I remember going on a mission trip to Mexico, where we went. It cost so much money to go, and I remember thinking to myself, um, why aren't we just going to like a local place? Because there are places in the US that like could really use our help, could really use our community service. And it felt odd to me that we would travel so far to this place in Mexico just to, well, when we got there, it was almost like, it wasn't a resort, but it was almost like a summer camp. And I felt so icky the whole time we were there. We got there and we like put our bags down on our bunk beds. And I thought we were going to be like sleeping on the ground or something. I didn't know much at all where we were actually going to. I just wanted to help. I was in like high school. Um, and some of the people we were there with were complaining about our like bunk beds, that they were like really close together. And I remember being like kind of horrified that that was even a thing, because that wasn't what the trip was about. Like, did they expect to come here and like be comfortable? Like, weren't we here to serve and like help people? And then the whole time we were there, we would like go to these orphanages, and like they paired us up with like one of the orphans, and then that was like our kid to watch that week. And then they would feed us food, and it felt so unnecessary. Like, we had paid thousands of dollars to fly to this country to babysit kids who really didn't need babysat. Like, some of them were older. And then we would have like worship services in the evening, and there was like a pool like at the place we were staying, and they would give us food and stuff. And so, and then they had at the end, at the end of the trip, they gave us at the end of the trip, they had this little market where we could like get souvenirs and stuff. So like all of the people from our church were like spending a bunch of money on like souvenirs to bring home, and the whole trip just felt so bad. So I yeah, I don't even. We read a book later on. Then when I was doing my missions training, we read a book called When Helping Hurts. So I think the school that I was like doing it through was trying to get out of that um, type of missions work that's just like feels kind of like a colonizer mindset. Um, but I had a hard time with that even as a Christian. I hated that.
And it almost seems like it'd be better to, if like for example they're struggling with getting enough food for themselves, just to give them whatever. If you add up all the money that everybody spent on their plane tickets and all that, say it was $10,000 or $20,000, just if you can
Yeah.
find someone reliable and trustworthy in that group and give them the money, let them just make sure everybody gets fed.
Yeah.
Hmm. It's interesting you mentioned the word colonizer. That's been one of the most fascinating concepts for me to realize that, like, I would have never in a million years as a Christian, especially as someone that was very interested in and moving towards doing missions. I even went to New Tribes Mission School for a year to do tribal missions. But realizing when you escape that definitely is a colonizing aspect to this, I think it's pretty minimal in the sense of what I wanted to do. But once you realize that Christianity is just a version of mythology, and that if you're intent on spreading it, you're spreading basically your culture with that. And to realize these people, not that they're necessarily doing okay. I mean, some of them are really struggling. They do need help, but they don't need to become westernized over this. I remember, reading stories or hearing stories in New Tribes where, you ever heard of girl pulling?
Mm-mm.
It's a horrible, horrible thing. But in these tribal groups, a lot of them, if a guy say he wanted to marry a girl who was in a tribe, one tribe over, and he had a couple ways to do it, but one of the ways was to just literally go in the middle of the night and kind of grab her and kidnap her and take her and take her back to his tribe, and she kind of becomes his wife. But if the men of the tribe where the girl is currently, if they realize it's happening, they will start to grab her back. And there were stories where they'd literally have two men pulling on the girl's legs in one direction and two guys pulling in her arms the other direction, and they just pull her to death. Things like that are obviously horrible. That's not a good tribal situation. There's some ways where that, help needs to happen there. And certainly people just dying of, easily curable diseases. So I'm not saying that we should just, leave everybody alone. I know there's people that encourage that, like, just leave them all alone. I'm not one of those people. I think there's people that need help desperately, especially medically. But even, some cultural things where they're truly being brutal. I remember hearing a lot of stories where men would treat women like property, and it was not uncommon for a missionary to see a man take a stick that was in the fire and literally just poke it right into his wife's, thigh or something to kind of burn her into doing what he wants. There's some cultural things that need to shift. That's horrible to the way they treat people. But mixed in with that, there's definitely a colonizing side of it. And I struggle a lot with how much of that was part of my background. I don't know if I'm able to yet acknowledge and see how much of that was part of my background, but I do know that when you look at some of these groups, even if I personally wouldn't have wanted to do it, you get the sense that a lot of missionaries, when they leave, they expect a westernized church to be there. They want people who can sing Amazing Grace, but in the tribal language. The kids sing Jesus Loves Me in the tribal language. The people start to, if there were, topless women, they start to wear clothes. No boobs out in church anymore. If they are, um, whatever they're doing, they start to look like a westernized society. And even if that wasn't the intentional stated goal, it's kind of what ends up happening. You have a physical church building, and it's going to be made of like a grass hut, maybe, but it's some kind of physical church building, and same kind of setup where you got worship songs, a preacher, an invitation to the gospel, and go spread the word if you can to the other tribes. That was the ideal, and it kind of is creepy once you realize what you're doing. You're like, yeah, I didn't mean to be a colonizer, but that's kind of what I was doing in a backward sense.
And even kind of the underlying the underlying belief of like, oh, I'm saving them. I'm saving
Yes.
them from their old ways. I'm redeeming them. Um, it's it's just a mindset that can't coexist with like a true respect and with a true respect for another culture. And this goes along with the mindset of like, I don't have an ego, I'm just right. Like, I think I had that mindset kind of as a Christian, like, and I would get really frustrated over like, because I wanted to help people, but I had no room for a while to, I had no room to acknowledge that anyone else could have achieved anything close to the truth in the way that I had. Um, I just couldn't even acknowledge that. And so you really can't respect cultures or have any kind of humility when you have that mindset towards people.
Yeah. It's like they really just need to shut up and listen because you've got the words of life. They need to stop whatever they're doing and just focus on you because you got
Yeah.
all these wonderful things to tell them. And yeah, it's amazing, the pride. Well, in terms of keep continuing with church just a little bit more, and then I want to turn it to your deconversion story. What were you taught about male leadership in church and your role as a woman? And what was your expectation going forward if you had stayed in Christianity?
At the private Christian school I went to, they didn't even let women teach on stage, even during chapel, which they consider very different than Sunday morning church, even though it was basically a Sunday morning service. But we had chapel every day of the week, and they didn't let women speak unless it was just telling their testimony or just telling. It was this weird loophole where women could be on stage as long as they weren't reading from the Bible. And that's so funny to me in hindsight because like I hear these stories about like the Amish where they can't be on like a phone, so they'll have this phone booth out back that they'll go like um it's not in their house, so it's okay. It's like separate and attached, and they find these loopholes, and then you realize like your own culture, your own religion had all these loopholes that were just so arbitrary like that. And I remember being really frustrated about that as a Christian because I think the way I was raised was not that extreme, but it was still very much like women are emotional. They shouldn't really be in positions of power. It's okay if they like want to speak. I think a woman pastor, I think I would have had an issue with that. It's kind of hard to say now because I kind of like slowly transitioned into a more like liberal or progressive Christian view as I was deconstructing. But yeah,
Mhm.
even at my private Christian university, I had an issue with the lack of like women representation because like half of our school was girls. So I was thinking in my head, wouldn't they want to reach that demographic? And wouldn't it be a great way to reach that demographic by having like other women speaking on this stuff? So, and yeah.
What was your expectation if you had been stayed as a Christian, um, in terms of marriage and family and kids? Was there any pressure to kind of be, having a whole bunch of little soldiers for Jesus? Was there any pressure to be a pastor's wife, or a missionary's wife? Like, what would they have said was some of the best possible outcomes for you if you'd stayed a Christian?
I wanted to be a pastor's wife for so long. Like, and
Mm,
I think that was because for me as like a white woman and the system of Christianity worked for me really well. So when I was going to church and uh when I would go to church multiple evenings a week and like go to help my dad set up ahead of time and everyone around the church knew me, I really liked it. I like that was just my entire identity. And church was my only hobby. I didn't learn to have hobbies until I was an atheist. Um,
good way to put it.
yeah. And so I just had nothing else on my mind other than like I wanted to do ministry, and specifically like I would have loved to marry a pastor, but or like a missionary, I guess.
Yeah.
But I don't think that was another thing that wasn't like explicitly taught to me, but I think just because I had a really good experience in the church, I think it kind of like leans me in that direction.
Would you have been expected, or would there be pressure to have a huge family so that you could kind of, as I like to say, outbreed the pagans?
Yeah. I don't think there was too big of a pressure to, well, actually my dad would constantly tell me stuff like, if you want to be a stay-at-home mom, that's amazing. Like that would be a very respectable job. Like so he would constantly reiterate how noble of a thing that is, but at the same time um he encouraged me to go to school, and he encouraged me to like pursue my own career and everything too. So I don't think
Good.
it was super blatant compared to some people, because even now my parents aren't really have never asked me if I'm gonna like when I'm gonna have kids, which has kind of surprised me, honestly.
Yeah, but my background was not. It was probably very similar to yours, where it's kind of like, whatever happens happens, and if God blesses you with lots of kids, or He blesses you with one or two,
Right,
whatever,
right.
just like whatever God does is fine. But I
Yeah,
know in a lot of groups, there's just that pressure to kind of not necessarily be the Duggars, but to, do your best to have a big family. Because I mean,
yeah,
I say it tongue in cheek to outbreed the pagans, but it's kind of true. Like if you can just fill the world with people who are absolutely going to vote, you know, Christian, Republican, fill the world, with people are going to vote your way, um, then you're eventually going to win the vote because you got people voting all your way. You're all going to look the same. And I think that concept was in a lot of groups that I wasn't necessarily in tight with, but I was exposed to them. It's interesting too. Did you have a strong sense of, with going back to the patriarchy a little bit, that guys couldn't talk to girls unless they talked to the daddy first?
yeah. And it's funny because my now husband, when he was my boyfriend at the time, and like before we had gotten engaged, I wanted him so badly to ask my dad. And that was something we had kind of deconstructed and were atheist by this point, but that was still such a big part of like my background, my tradition. And it's funny because now, and he did end up asking, but now I don't think I would have him ask. Now I feel kind of odd about it, and I feel like it takes away some autonomy from myself in a sense. Even though at the time I was kind of like, oh, it's just a beautiful traditional thing, but I I I think I've changed my mind on that now. But yeah, there was very much this like the man should lead, he'll ask my dad for my hand in marriage and all that.
Yeah, and it ends up for a lot of groups looking a lot like the girl's kind of the property of the daddy until the daddy passes the girl on to become the property of the new husband. And it's not that anybody would ever call a girl property, but it's the treatment is very similar, and they would just call it, you're under the daddy's protective covering or whatever, under his roof, obviously, but under his protective covering as a um, the kind of the umbrella picture, like, there's like God, there's Christ, there's the church, there's the man, there's the wife, there's the children, and you're kind of under your daddy's umbrella until you become under your wife's, new husband's umbrella.
That's exactly how my partner viewed it. So when he when he was hesitant to ask, it was because he didn't want to treat me like property in that exact way that you're explaining.
Hmm. Kudos to him. That's
And
awesome.
he explicitly told me that too, but yeah.
Yeah. Just as a side note, the idea of girls as property, we talked before a little bit about genocide a while ago, and it's amazing to me when you look back at those stories. I mean, you really like not just a cursory glance, but just diving deep into all the details of what they said happened. I know a lot of it is mythology, where it's rewritten history of something else that happened. They just kind of rewrote it the way they wanted. But when you just read it the way it's written, the way it's given to you, you do have these stories where in like the conquest of Canaan, where men are instructed to go in and slaughter everyone, including the older people, the men and women, the children, but to let the young virgins live. And I don't think people, I know I didn't do this, but I think Christians just don't really visualize. Like, I think if you just visualized what this would be like to actually actively do this and live it out, it would kind of shake you up. Like, I was thinking, okay, I'm sure there would be some soldiers in the Jewish army, if that had existed, that would have been older men. But say there's a younger man who's very, very, strong. He's a good soldier, but he's only, 16, 17, 18, but he can fight like anybody else. And he goes into an actual house, and maybe the husband's already been killed outside, but there's a mom there with a baby nursing, and the mom's just quivering, begging, please leave us alone. And his job is to, and then he sees this 13-year-old girl in the other corner trying to hide as well. And he knows in his mind, if this had been all true, his job is to slaughter the mom and the nursing baby, and to take that girl. And if he's not married, she's pretty much fair game. Whatever, give her appropriate period of mourning, whatever they do, they make her shave her head for a month or something. But give her mourning and then take her as your wife. And you're sitting there thinking, I need to take my sword and my spear, whatever, spear the mom, spear the baby, and as this woman who sees me do this to her own mother and her own, younger brother or whatever, I've now killed them, and I'm supposed to have her as my bride. And that's somehow supposed to honor God, and is supposed to be this glorious story of, the way that God's holiness plays out. And it's just so unbelievably horrific. And I mean, it's disgusting, obviously, but it's a horrific thing. And I think from the perspective of a soldier, a young man doing that, you'd think, wouldn't you spend the rest of your life having nightmares about what you had just done? Maybe how would you enjoy a day of your life with your new bride, knowing that you had done that to her mother and to the younger baby? How could you live a day of your life without constant nightmares in your own mind? And yet that's somehow portrayed as this glorious story of God conquering Canaan and giving the promised land to his chosen people. It's like, this is disgusting stuff. And yet it's held up as wonderful. And I wish people had portrayed, like, I wish in my mind, even just personally, I wish I had thought through, like, what would it have been like to have actually obeyed this? Or if you said that story about the stoning of children who were disobedient, belligerent to their parents, and stubborn for a period of time, even if it's an older child, that you have to actually take them before the elders and cast the first stone and kill them. And that if this wasn't an issue of Yahweh versus Jesus, if Yahweh and Jesus are one and the same, God, Jesus says, I am the Father of one, then this was not a law versus grace thing. Jesus commanded this stoning. So there you are, honoring Yahweh, the same as Jesus, to stone your own children. I mean, it's just bizarre when you think about it. And yet I never really put myself in those shoes of, let me pick up the spear, let me pick up the stone. Did you ever like kind of visualize what it would have been like to do that?
I not as a Christian. Now I want to ask Christians, like, if God came to you in this modern day and asked you specifically, hey, this country over here, North Korea, every single one of them is evil. Complete every single one, every last one. I need you to get rid of them. Like, would you as a Christian like actually do that? Like, and how would you be sure that that was really God telling you? Because what if you're wrong? What if you didn't hear the voice right, or you interpreted it slightly different, and well, you just murdered people? Like, it's like, it just doesn't add up. And I don't think people realize that these were like real people who just thought they were hearing from God and went and did these things. Just like we might be commanded to today. Like, are you willing to take up that like call if God told you to go slaughter people today? Like, and if you wouldn't do it today, then why was it okay for them to do it then? And then
Yeah.
also, the whole idea of every last person being just evil to the point of like there's no redemption, like not even like we just need to annihilate them. That's what like every culture said about their surrounding nations who they conquered like during this time. And it was super common during this time for leaders to attribute war success to their gods from this time. Like every culture from this time, from this context, did that. So why do we like give grace here to these rulers when they do it and say, oh, this was justified when they wiped out these people, when they conquered this land, but then not be consistent with the other cultures that were doing it, even though everyone was doing it during this time? Like it starts to sound like maybe it was just something written by men, like fallible humans in a context where that was just the natural thing.
Yeah.
And then also, why would, this is like going to be nitpicky, but like if everyone from that nation is evil and just bad, why save the virgins? They're evil and bad, right? So like it would make more sense to save the babies, because then you
Yeah.
could raise them up differently. But like the virgins, it's just, maybe it's written by men from an ancient context. Like
Yeah.
it just stops once you actually start puzzling it all together. It just stops adding up in the way that it used to.
Yeah. That's a really good point. Yeah, the virgins would be old enough to have worshipped idols, so they're just going to teach their
Right.
kids. Yeah,
Like
it's a good
it's
point.
starting to sound like women are just property, like like exactly like they viewed them in the context it was written.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. It really does, and I think you're hitting on a really good point. The part of a lot of people's deconstruction is realizing that this just doesn't sound divine anymore. It just doesn't sound from some kind of amazing God. And one of the biggest questions or thoughts that I had as I was going through my deconstruction, very related to what you just said, is this doesn't sound like the best we could do. Like if there's a God whose ways are so much higher than ours, and he's so much better and amazing than us, this just doesn't sound like the best he could do. This sounds like like you could easily argue this is very man-made. If God were real, wouldn't he make it so that you couldn't argue very strongly that this is man-made? It would be very difficult to make that argument. You would just look at it over and over and slice it and dice it every way and say, God's fingerprints are just all over this book. And there's so many ways that that falls apart, both in terms of the way that people try to make up the whole thing of fulfilled prophecy, or especially the prophecies about Jesus. And you're like, no, I can explain all of it a very different way easily. Like they did, Jesus didn't fulfill prophecies. They nitpicked certain verses from the Old Testament and wrote a story, a mythological story, and wove it and made him look like he fulfilled prophecies, and then claimed, look, he fulfilled prophecies. That doesn't mean any of it's like you can just tear it apart from so many different angles. And the more that I realized that fact, like this doesn't feel right, this doesn't feel divine, that was like some of the first steps that actually began to unwind, this thing, because it's hard to get to that point. It's a very weird point to get to, but it takes and people, I've learned people's personalities are different. For some people, it is the mythology stuff, the comparative mythology. For some people, they need to dig into stuff like suffering, like why does God let kids die with cancer at 3 years old? Everybody's got different things, but something nicks at that wall enough, and eventually there's holes start breaking through. And I wanted to kind of use that maybe as a segue to ask you to start to paint the picture. What were some of the earliest, chinks in the wall for your story? Like what got you thinking originally that maybe there's more to this that I didn't originally think through or understand?
I think there were a lot of times throughout, not a lot of times, but I think there were moments throughout like taking my theology classes where I would hear them say the Christian answer to a question that I had never even thought of. Um,
Hmm.
like for example, like they would bring up like, well, there were changes in the Bible like across time, but they were so little, they were so minute that they were so little that you can't they were so little that they don't change the real meaning. And it's kind of like, well, at what point, it's that analogy, like if you replace a um if you replace a plank on a boat one by one, until at what point is the whole boat just a completely different boat? Like at what point is it too far from the original meaning? If it can slowly shift over time. And so that started bringing up some issues with biblical inerrancy, but I quickly suppressed them because I was still in my little bubble of everybody around me was just nodding as if his answer was sufficient. So that made me question myself and think I must be hearing it wrong. There must be some more information that I'm missing somehow, that like this does add up. I'm just wrong. So, and then with the busyness of like being in college, I just kind of suppressed all of that really fast.
Did you ever get the sense too that like you might have a legitimate concern in a sense now because you're looking at it on the surface, but if you really understood, like say you were a scholar of ancient Hebrew, or you are, you know, an advanced archaeologist, like that there's some PhD biblical scholar out there that could just spin circles around us as, you know, lay people who don't know too much. We've not studied it, but if you just understood what the true amazing scholars understood, your questions will be laid to rest. Did you ever get that sense? I'm speaking for
Yeah,
myself here a bit.
yeah. And I remember thinking when some of those issues were coming up with biblical inerrancy, I remember thinking that I don't know how I can trust really any translation other than the original. So I remember thinking that I remember placing a really big pressure on myself that I needed to like be looking up words constantly. Unfortunately, this was like senior year, so I hadn't been able to take classes on like the original languages or anything. But
Like you were going into the lexicon and stuff and seeing what it really meant.
yeah. And but then it came to this frustration that's like, I could do this my whole life forever and still not study it enough.
Hmm.
And so that kind of brought me to this like confusion or frustration because I was trying so hard to decipher what the original message was. But you can, and when I would read it in English, it's like you can put a different emphasis on every single word and change kind of the how it's communicated. So then that brought up issues like, how does anyone know that they are like studying this correctly unless they've devoted their whole life to it? But then what if you devote your whole life to it and just to find out that Islam was the correct religion? And it's like, at what point do you stop and admit like we can't measure the divine, or we are coming to different conclusions, and it's best to just listen to as many people as we can to try to get like the most truth, because our one perspective is just not going to be sufficient. So then you kind of have to humble yourself and like just keep trying to learn, I guess.
Yeah. I love what you're saying there, and it's a great point. And you could spend your whole life and still be, like you said, wrong. You could be wrong either about the right God or about the interpretation. And it begs the question, like if God is the God of order, not chaos, and if he wants himself to be known, why doesn't he make it really, really clear? Why would he do it in a language which, in a sense, you know, there's just open to so many interpretations. Language originally with, you know, no vowel points, so you could even read the same word, you're just reading the consonants, and you could, you know, put different vowels in and have a different word. Like why not make this crystal clear, especially if there's that much at stake? The message should be clear. And I would just add to it too, there's a bigger context of, if you're a God who really wants this to be clear, well, why don't you want it to be clear to everybody? Why would you give it in Hebrew? Why don't you give it in every language? And why don't you do it, craft, you know, work in such a way that there's some kind of universal language that everyone can clearly understand your message? And I remember personally a guy that he did not unfortunately directly influence my deconstruction, but he kind of laid a seed a good 10 years before my deconstruction. He's a guy who's a liberal Christian, and I asked him, like, "Where are you with Christ? You know, what are you a Christian, whatever?" Because I knew he went to church, but it was like one of those liberal churches where the lady pastor and they'd bless the animals. They have this monthly blessing for the dogs. And I was like, that doesn't sound like a real church to me. But so I asked him, "Where are you with God?" And he's like, "Well, let me just ask you this question. I'll ask you a question back, just like Jesus does." He doesn't answer the question; he asks the question back. So my question is, does it make sense that, you know, on this map of the world, God would speak to this one little tribe right here instead of to everybody at all times? Does that make sense? And of course, that answers at the time. But as I thought on it later, I thought, yeah, why wouldn't God make it clear? Like, why wouldn't He let the Chinese know at the exact same time? Why wouldn't He let the Koreans know at the exact same time? What about everyone in South America? Why do they have to sit in silence for generations and millennia with no idea about what the true message is? Like, why? And it definitely, when you add those together with, not only does He not tell everybody, but the people that He does tell, it's not really clear. It ends up being very suspicious. Like you said, it looks like it's not divine.
Yeah, because I was always taught knock and the door will be open. So then at the time when I was desperately seeking and the door was still not opening, it kind of affirmed to me either one, God is rejecting me, or two, he doesn't exist. And because I knew my heart, I knew that I was seeking and it wasn't clear. It wasn't, the more I sought, the less clear it became. So I felt a really intense feeling of abandonment because of that. Because I
God,
thought that yeah, from God specifically, because I thought that I had this, I thought that I had this relationship with him. And then in my time of like my time of need, it was just radio silence. And all of these questions were coming up that would lead to more questions. And um, I kind of had a somewhat Calvinist-ish perspective. So I don't think I had totally like decided this is it for sure, but I think I kind of leaned towards Calvinist view. And so I had this moment where I remember like thinking, God rejected me. Like he's there, but he rejected me. And now I just don't know where to go from here. And then that led to me going through like all the stages of grief before kind of coming to this conclusion that's like, what's the difference between a God who exists and doesn't interact with you versus a God that just doesn't exist? There really isn't a difference in how, yeah.
it's a great point. And I think when you're kind of go doing the self-talk at that point, thinking through it to yourself quietly, because it's hard to talk to other people about it, about your lack of faith. But when you realize, like what you're saying, this, when I was looking most for answers, there was radio silence. And you kind of say to yourself, maybe the reason there's radio silence is because he's just not there. And
Yeah,
when you realize it, you're like, holy smokes, is that even an option? It's like,
yeah,
whoa. But then you realize like that actually, if you're an investigator, that conclusion fits the puzzle pieces so much better than anything else.
it does. Yeah.
Hmm. Did that shake you up when you said it to yourself for the first time?
I I deconstructed over probably a 2-year span where I was like really diving in, and that was after college. And I spent so many nights like crying on my bathroom floor, just asking for God to reveal himself. Like, um, so yeah, it was a lot to take in and to try to come to terms with. And then there was also this piece that kind of, even though I didn't choose, I wanted God. The system always worked amazing for me. I loved everything about Christianity. So then to it was so confusing then when the puzzle pieces started kind of falling apart or not fitting together to begin with. I was incredibly shaken up, and I didn't even want to say it in my thoughts that I didn't believe in God for a long time, because I was afraid that just saying it in my thoughts would be like, damn me, it would damn me to hell.
Hmm.
So it was like out of the question. But then that inner turmoil that caused then, because like I said, like you don't believe, or you don't choose what you believe. Like you can't just choose to think the moon is made of cheese, like on command, if you don't already think that. Like the information or the context has to change, which then affects what you think. And so, but at the time I still was thinking like, am I choosing this? But I'm not choosing this. And I think I kind of made peace at the time by just reminding myself, if God is there and he exists, then he knows my heart and he knows I'm seeking. And even though I can't feel him on my end, he knows my heart, and he wouldn't send me to hell over a misunderstanding. And I think that helped me get through that fear of like hell and the fear of questioning. And I think that's what that that feeling of being kind of like shaken up was what helped me like push forward in my deconstruction, because then I was like frantically trying to find answers. And I think I moved a lot faster than other people because I was trying to avoid that feeling of like cognitive dissonance and tension and turmoil. Um, so yeah, I think it kind of like spurred me on in my journey.
Awesome. I love how you're describing that. I think too, I just add this whole idea of realizing that he's not real. It kind of, you remember that movie Beautiful Mind with Russell Crowe, I think it
Yeah.
was, where he's like imagining people that aren't there because he's just got some kind of mental issue. It, if you could imagine that that's kind of story we're about, instead of about imaginary people, they're, you know, your employer who's employing you as a spy or whatever, code breaker, but instead that those imaginary people are like angels, and there's, you know, this imaginary God that's talking to you. When you begin to think through it and you realize this isn't real, it's almost like you have to do a little beautiful mind work where you think, I I don't think this is real. And then when you leave, you're like, you some people are like so angry, like, God, why aren't you here? You know, I'm waiting for you to give an answer. I'm waiting for you to come through, burst through in your glory, you know, show us your grace and your power. All the kind of things you hear in worship songs, you know, just shine forth, make yourself known. And you realize like you're so angry in a sense, like God, why aren't you showing up when I most need you? And it hits you like a ton of bricks, so to speak. Like, who are you talking to? Like when you're saying, God, 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 please come through, you just have to say to yourself eventually, like, who the hell are you talking to? There's nobody there. You are talking to the wall and the drywall and the ceiling. Like you're not talking to anybody. And for me, that also helped when I actually did deconvert and I felt that anger of like, I felt so angry at first of like, I was so deceived. People didn't tell me, you know, everything from just the idea that there might not be a God to specifics about why didn't people tell me there's 60 gospels and 6 books of Acts? Why didn't people tell me that the quotes Iliad and the Odyssey all over the gospels? And why didn't people tell me the gospel of Mark is structured according to the zodiac and the right order of the constellations? I'm like, why didn't you all tell me this stuff? And God, why didn't you? I'm like, who are you talking to? Like and you realize that the fight is not against you versus God or you versus the devil or whatever. The fight is you against yourself and your own, like you're breaking out of this prison for the first time. And you realize that we've all been in this prison, but it's a prison that's self-inflicted. God didn't put us in this prison. Satan didn't put us in this prison. We put ourselves, well, I mean, arguably, you know, some really bad men 3,000 years ago put us in this prison, but we've chosen since with the key in our hands, we've chosen to stay in this prison. We're free to leave at any point, but we've said we like our dark, cold cell compared to whatever's on the outside because we can't imagine the beauty and the warmth of the sunshine when we leave. It just feels like it's so scary to think about what could it be like on the other side. This prison is what I've always known. And you're like, why am I so angry? There's
And
no
it's
one to be angry about but myself, you know? I chose to not be willing to ask the hard questions, and now that I've asked them, I realize I was talking to myself the whole time. God was a construct in my brain, and I've been literally playing a beautiful mind for decades.
and I think one of the reasons it's so hard to know how to like process those like emotions and that kind of like anger or confusion, is because the whole system was a lie. It's not, you can't direct it at a God because you don't believe in God. You can't direct it at your family members or friends who abandoned you as you were deconstructing because they were victims of the system too. It's almost this frustration at like, you kind of look, or I personally viewed almost everyone as like this victim to the system, or everybody's just kind of going off of each other, and they were misled. And I think there are some people that abuse the system, but I think overall it's mostly people that are just trying to find their way themselves, and they don't have the answers necessarily. So then when you leave that system and then people kind of ostracize you, or you're dealing with trust issues because you don't even know which way is upside down anymore, and it's all very confusing. It leads to this anger, but you know it's not someone's fault, but you're still angry because you wasted so much time, so much, you put your whole heart, your whole identity into this thing just to find out it wasn't real. It's so confusing to know how to direct that then.
A lot of people at that point would go through like a grieving process of sorts. Did you feel like you went through that, just grieving, I don't know, the loss of time in reality, so to speak, the loss of maybe a much healthier self perspective, healthier sexuality, healthier worldview in general? Did you feel like you had to do some real, like, kind of either metaphorical or literal, just crying tears of like all that I lost and all that I could have had that was right in front of me? I had a feast in front of me, and I chose to, feast on scraps this whole time, on dry bread. And like, how did you go through the process of getting over the loss and restarting?
Yeah, I think I went through, I think it mirrored the grieving process almost identically. Like every single stage of grief I can almost like list back that I went um through very distinct time periods, because it's like at first you're in denial, and then you are just like heartbroken, completely heartbroken, and then you get angry. And I had my angry atheist phase, and unfortunately I would post stuff on my personal story, because I had lost my whole community, my friends, and then the whole like Black Lives Matter, Trump stuff started happening, and I had been an atheist at that point, but it was at the very beginning of me like just accepting that I was an atheist when all that kind of political turmoil started happening. And it just pushed me over the edge. And I remember posting something on my story that was like connecting, on my Instagram story, and it was just connecting like how it was some post talking about how like the Bible supports slavery. I don't know how, I forget how it came up, but it was somehow connected to like Black Lives Matter stuff. But then I started, like after that, I started like regularly posting on my story about just like stuff like that. And it was kind of messy because I hadn't completely processed everything through. I think there was part of me that kind of needed a sounding board for like other Christians or just people who believe differently than me, because I had lost all my Christian friends when I like deconstructed, and I had moved to a new state, so I wasn't in a Bible study currently anymore, and I needed somebody to talk to, and I think that came out very like unorganized on Instagram.
As you were going through that, you're saying that Christians were like pushing you away or shunning you. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, and I think I I had a few friends who, while I was deconstructing, we were all just out of college, and I think they were moving on with their lives, and because I was deconstructing, I was clinging on to those relationships, like they were all that I had, because it was such a tumultuous time. And
Like you were
so,
trying to hold on to the relationship with the Christians?
yeah, and basically if I brought up something about like evolution or biblical inerrancy, or just questioning my faith, um, I think it was too draining for them to be handling all of my changing lifestyle and beliefs at the same time. And they didn't have room to or space to begin to question. And one of them is in ministry, and one of them um, works at a Christian company, but or a Christian school technically. But so I think it was too draining. And
Yeah,
yeah,
just
so
too
then
much for them to take.
yeah.
Yeah, have you ever heard of the idea of what's the phrase I'm looking for? The idea of it's just terrorizing to them, and it's terror management, where like you might have thought to yourself, 3 years ago, maybe 3 years before your deconversion, the phrase, if none of this is real, then heaven and hell aren't real. But maybe at that point, when you said that to yourself, you were thinking, but thankfully Jesus is real and heaven and hell are real. So you kind of had like an original thought, and then maybe the same thought comes up, 2 months later. If this isn't real, heaven and hell aren't real, but I'm 99.9% sure it's real. And then, it keeps on going. And eventually it's like, I'm 50% sure that this is real. But, so you kind of thought through if heaven and hell, or if this worldview of Christianity is correct, heaven and hell are real. If it's not correct, then they're not real. But you've had a bunch of hits where you've had time to kind of get, kind of sucker punched by how hard this would be to realize this. And you've kind of learned to flint. You've learned, you got a few bruises from the reality of this concept, and you've kind of healed from it, and you built up the calluses, so to speak, so that by the time it actually like just wallops you and says it's not real and there's no heaven and hell, bam, you're already rock solid. Like, come at me. I already know this. I can deal with the hard punch of reality. I can fight back. I can deal with it. Whereas for other people, it's just like they've never thought about it before, and it's like they just get sucker punched by this idea, and it's like it will knock them down like a tree that's got no roots, that where the roots have been severed, and a big storm comes and they're just going to topple. And so for them, they know how much terror this would bring if what you're saying is even remotely true. And so to them, it's like it's easier, I think, just to say, I'd rather not talk about it. I can't deal with this.
Yeah, and I think there's almost a subconscious part of it that's like to admit that, not admit, but to go down that route, to ask me what I've been learning, to take my questions at face value instead of like brushing them to the side. That would be to almost, even that would be to entertain that I could be right, or that Christianity could be wrong. And with the stakes being so high and them possibly risking eternal damnation or losing their community, losing a system that works really well for them, it's just losing their job even maybe. It's just it I think even subconsciously people back away from that, whether or not, just because it's just too much.
Can I ask you a side question on that note, real quick? But related, do you ever wonder if people kind of secretly, in the very deepest recesses of their minds, sort of know that this isn't real, but that it's just there's a, not that they would admit it's a game they're playing, but like what I mean is, if going back to that analogy of house fire burning, if we really believed it, like you believe your neighbors left and right, back and forth, they're all in a burning house, then the idea of you spending a whole bunch of money, for example, to go on a nice vacation, so you go 2 weeks to Disney World or something, and whatever it is, I'm sure it's pretty big price tag to go on some of those vacations, and you're concerned about buying really fancy sneakers at some point, and this, that, and the other, and your world is consumed by all these things that are kind of self-centered in a sense. Not that they're bad. It just you're living your life doing these things, taking vacations, buying things for yourself. If it's really true that everyone's about to burn, and kind of in God's eyes they're already condemned, they're already kind of burning, wouldn't you drop everything even as something as simple as watching football, like a 2-hour football game. Isn't that 2 hours you could have spent either witnessing or getting ready to witness? Like, why would you do any of these other things? Nothing matters compared to the gospel. And yet people kind of live like, yeah, I like to watch every single football game every Sunday. And we go on vacations a couple times a year, and I'm looking for the next big, nice car. It's like, you're not living like people are about to burn. You're living like you don't really actually believe it. And the other example I often give for this is when someone actually dies who's a Christian. To me, if you believe that Christianity is real, when someone dies in Christ, they have just graduated into glory. They just won the lottery. Whether they died in a car accident, or they died of old age, or they died of cancer early at age 20, whatever the reason is, if they're gone and they had Christ as their savior, they just won the biggest lottery ever. They won $1 trillion. And why would you spend the rest of your life bemoaning it and saying, "Oh, this is so sad. They're taken so early. I can't believe they died at age 20." Like, that's not a bad thing. That's a great thing. They got spared this sinful, dying, decaying world. They graduated to glory. You should be doing nothing but having a party. And yet, issues like this, examples like this, kind of betray to me the idea that maybe on some kind of secret level, you actually don't believe this stuff. I don't know. It makes me, I feel like I'm psychoanalyzing, and I'm not necessarily qualified to psychoanalyze on any level, but I can't help but think about that stuff.
Or with like age of accountability stuff. If you believe there's an age of accountability, like that babies do go to heaven, why wouldn't abortion be the best thing you could possibly do? Because like thou shalt not kill in the Bible technically means thou shalt not murder without just cause. And isn't it a just cause to save a baby, a child, from suffering eternally? Like, and I've heard people say stuff like, well, but that's not for you to take into your hands. That's just for God to deal with. But if I had a child, I would be happy to save them if I truly thought that they were going to burn eternally. That's the kind of thinking that makes me think people might not grasp how bad eternal damnation is. And that kind of has confused me too before.
Yeah, but it's a good example, and it's like it's hard to think that people really believe this stuff, because if you really believed it, you would live differently. And of course, that's what pastors love to. I mean, that'll preach. Like, if you
Yeah.
really believe this, then live it, people. Well, it's like, no, but it's not an issue of if you really believe it, you need to start living it. It's that if you really believed it, you would automatically live it. If you really thought that hell was real, you don't need a preacher to talk it up. You just go try to
Yeah.
rescue people. Um,
And
and
I
so the idea of having a revival service to get back to a biblical worldview and start actually trying to save people, you wouldn't need a revival service. You just know there's too much at stake and I have to save people. But people act like, well, yeah, it's not a big deal. I've got to focus on my football game. Come on.
and something that was like really hard for me to get past when my friends kind of distanced themselves instead of wanting to like dive in and figure out the questions with me. Like in my head, all I could think of was they think I'm going to hell. They genuinely think I'm going to hell.
And that you
And
deserve it.
that I deserve it and that I'm like willfully choosing it, and their response is to back up. And that was that really was a hard piece because from my perspective, I was I when I came to them with concerns or told them like I was questioning evolution or like it was starting to look like pretty legit, like there it was evolution's pretty backed up, like instead of asking me questions, they just kind of panicked and then like assumed that like my falling out from religion actually had to do with like because I had a boyfriend, and like it was just very heartbreaking in a sense because I wanted to go into missions originally to save strangers, and they didn't even want to it seemed like they didn't even want to save someone who they had lived with for years and years, and like I considered them my best friend. So it just didn't add up that they would abandon ship immediately instead of try everything they possibly could.
Yeah, agreed 100%. Boy, if you're preaching to the choir, I totally resonate with that. And it's shocking too that even something as simple as like, well, you know what, I don't want to get into some deep discussion, but tell me something you've been reading, show me some YouTube videos you've been watching, show me some, research papers, whatever. Let me follow along and let's have a nice discussion on it. I know that for me, um, whenever I've talked with loved ones about anything I've learned, whether it's the Gospels are full of stuff that are copies from the Iliad and the Odyssey from Homer, or from Euripides' Bacchae, or from Virgil's Aeneid, or from the Zodiac with the Gospel of Mark, or all kinds of other stuff, heavy copies from Plutarch and Philo and blah, 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 on it goes. Not a single person in my Christian circle of loved ones, not a single person, I mean, not one has ever said, show me something you're learning. Let's talk about it. No one, never. Not in, it's been 2.5, or going on 2.5 years now since my deconversion. Not a single person has asked that. Not even the dearest, closest people to me. And the other side of that too is interesting. I think you're kind of alluding to it, but from my experience, they treat you like a traitor as opposed to someone to save.
Yeah.
And that, to me, I don't know if you had this, but the snark goes off the charts as soon as you leave. They're like, I don't like start cursing, but basically they're like, screw you. If that's the way it is, screw you, buddy. If you're going to leave Christ, then I don't care what you think. I don't care anything about you. Just screw you. Go, get out of my face, get out of my life. And you're like, whoa, like if you really have the love of Christ in your heart and you think hell's real, which my circle of friends usually do, don't you think it's worth it to proclaim the gospel and also to love me back to Christ? They don't give a rat's ass about loving me back to Christ. No one in my circle has ever tried to love me back to Christ. And it wouldn't matter in one sense because I know it's not real, but it does kind of further the betrayal. I'm like, okay, I knew Christianity wasn't real because of all these other reasons with the mythology. But if you're going to, if there was something that could convince me, such as the power of a changed life, the gospel will transform people's lives. It will take a hard, calloused, hard heart and make it warm and gentle and gracious. Some of you people have been exposed to the gospel for decades, and you are as hard as nails and as nasty as can be, and snarky left and right. I'm like, if I were the kind of person who was looking at people to see whether or not Christianity were real, which I'm not, but if I were, that would shut it. Case closed. Christianity absolutely sucks as a gracious religion. The people who have the gospel in their lives for decades will treat you like garbage. And boy, is that, once you see it, you're like, oh my gosh. And that phrase comes to mind, there's no hate like Christian love, but it's very true. And not saying atheists can't be hateful either, for sure. Anyone can be hateful, but if Christians are that different, I've yet to see it.
And you
So
don't notice until, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
no, go for it.
It's something you don't notice until you're on the outside of the circle. It's loving and it works amazing and it's the best thing ever when you're on the inside, when you're in the in group. But then as soon as you're in their out group, it's just they just forget about you and it's a surreal experience. Yeah, I didn't face, other than like purity culture stuff, I didn't face religious trauma until like I was on the outside. And until I kind of went through those like falling out with like some of my Christian friends.
Yeah, it does. I think a lot of us are really hoping to have some of those relationships restored, but it does seem like for a lot of them, the way that the cards have fallen so far, unless it seems like unless some of them escape too, there's just no way for them to be restored. And it kind of like, I don't think I'm an angry atheist, but it really kind of makes me angry to think about some of the ways where this just destroys homes and marriages and you know parent-child relationships. I talk a lot to JWs who are a little bit more extreme in the shunning, as you may know. But like I've interviewed people where they like the dad escaped from Christianity, from JW version of it, but he's like, yeah, my kids got married and my kids got kids, I got grandkids, and I haven't talked to them in decades. Not my choice. They just won't talk to me. I'm like,
Mhm.
this stuff is got to go. This is crazy. And it's literally this mythology from thousands of years ago is destroying families today. And it just breaks my heart. Could I ask, speaking of religious healing, for religious trauma, even though maybe the trauma of people's hurting you and shunning you is more recent, the idea of the theology and the worldview is still like there's an implicit trauma of it taught you to see the reality of the world in a way that you have to undo. How did you deal with questions about the afterlife and just what your life is all about and how your life fits into time and eternity, so to speak?
Um,
Did it hurt you to realize there might not be a heaven?
yes, because I think I'm very much the type of person who like I love people, and even like my high school friends who I don't see anymore, people that I've met like that I met doing that summer mission trip, like I would always leave those kind of I would always leave those stages of life into my next stage of life and think it's okay, we're all going to be back together soon. Like we will all be back. All of these friends I've made along the way, like this isn't the end. And that gave me so much hope and peace. And now my view of death is that it's just going to be like going to sleep. And this isn't something that I'm super set on, but that's just the idea that makes the most sense in my head as far as I understand. Um,
But you
I
don't think you're going anywhere when you die?
know, and I used to get I get sad about that, but I get sad not being able to look forward to like a heaven in the way that I used to. But I realized my old view was not it wasn't just the heaven part. It was just the heaven part for me and my family and the people I loved, but I was completely forgetting the eternal damnation half. And when you think about like kind of how we've been talking about throughout, but just like if you really grasp the severity of that, how could you ever be happy in an afterlife knowing that people are there? Or how could you ever that just it starts to seem like the worst view. And I don't think that contributes to the credibility of a view, but I do think it contributed to me like healing and helping getting over the sadness of like not being able to partake in a heaven or because now my view is just it all ends and we'll all be at peace and it'll just be like sleeping, and I don't have to mourn over I would have to grieve and mourn so much more over the thought of like um real humans who lived on this earth being tortured forever. That's so much worse. And if I don't have to go, if I don't go to heaven, if we just all go to sleep at the end, I still think everyone going to sleep at the end is better than some people going to heaven and then some people burning, because nothing can make up for those people who have to be tortured forever.
It's a great point. I've never thought about it that way, but that makes a lot of sense. I like the way you put that. It's interesting. Speaking of that, when I was a Calvinist, one of the kind of points we would highlight is that from a Calvinist perspective, you can't choose God unless God chooses you first. So the idea too of if you when you were in that mindset as a Calvinist Christian, if God had gone to the people burning in hell and said, it's been 1,000 years. You probably had a pretty rough 1,000 years you're burning, but I'm in my graciousness going to give you a second chance. Would you all like to turn or burn at this point, now that you know what hell is like and now that you know that I'm real? From a Calvinist perspective, if God didn't elect you from the Lamb's Book of Life from before the foundation of the world, you would still proverbially lift the middle finger to God and say, no way, I'm bowing my knee to you. And you just stay in hell forever because God didn't elect you first. God didn't make you one of his children. It's interesting how the cold-heartedness of this worldview just gets so much colder in certain perspectives, certain theological constructs. It really, it betrays, I guess what I'm trying to say is it betrays to me the specific toxicity of this stuff, where it's not just bad ideas, it's like bad ideas breeding bad ideas. And it's like hell is the first idea, but then the second idea is like, you deserve it. Then it's like you're going to burn forever. You wouldn't leave hell even if you could because you don't obey God. And then maybe the pinnacle bad idea to it, from my perspective, is that Christians would actually ultimately rejoice. I mean, you have to praise God for both his salvation of those who are redeemed, and you'd have to praise God that he was just in his judgment of those who deserved it. You have to say, God, I'm going to, as it were, look on the corpses of those that you've destroyed and say, as much as I wish they could have repented. I mean, certainly, God expresses it, it's not my desire for anyone to be destroyed, but in a sense, it's like God said, why are you intent on dying? And, please come to me, please come to me. But if you're really intent on dying, then I will judge you. I will judge you with the ultimate judgment. And for Christians to have to look at that and say at the end, they chose coldness. God rewarded them with hardness. God ultimately rewarded that hardness and coldness with final judgment that was completely deserved. And we would have to applaud. We'd have to say, God, your holiness is the biggest issue here. Your holiness was resolved at Calvary. Your holiness had atonement had to happen. Punishment had to be meted out. We didn't get here because we're good. We got here because punishment was given to Jesus on our behalf. And ultimately, those who don't have their punishment taken by Jesus still deserve the punishment. And we would have to, in the end, clap for God. And it's amazing the way that this just, as you get deeper and deeper in the theology, it makes you proud when you're in it. You're like, I'm so proud that I understand. I should be applauding God doing genocide. I should be applauding God killing, these people forever, or destroying them forever and ever in hell. And I will just say too, I love the fact that apologists are often so crystal clear on this. They're not always. Sometimes they're very waffly. But some of them are like, they'll actually defend genocide. I'm sure you could probably YouTube it to say, apologists defending genocide or something like that. You could probably find apologists doing it. And as much as it's cringy to listen to, I love it because it feels like it's like you're saying, keep digging the hole deeper. Keep digging yourself deeper. People are escaping because people see how bad this stuff is. So keep telling us that you're defending genocide. The more that you talk, the more people leave. And I love it. I obviously wish they would stop, but it's amazing to me how they don't see that what they're doing is making people stop and say, what the hell am I in? Like, this is a cult. Any Christianity is a cult. Anyway, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I was just gonna say I get it, and the more you look into even like the specific language used, it just starts to sound like an abuser narrative. Straight from like starting out with like, I don't know how much you've heard of like how narcissists will navigate like relationships and stuff, but it starts with like the love bombing and like and then it like goes to to me, the love bombing kind of mirrors oh, Jesus did this all for you. He loves you. He wants you. He came to give you salvation. That's just going to make your life amazing. And then it kind of turns into this, like, you are worthless. This is, everything is like for God. And it's like, once I actually started listening to TikToks on like narcissism or like, parenting styles that are like toxic and stuff, that really started changing my mind about some of like the language and some of the like narrative and the whole dynamic that like God has with us. It starts sounding a lot more toxic the more you like dive into some of those things.
Yeah, like he's a bit of a psychopath, the Yahweh character. Like, I love you so much, but if you don't let me back, I'm gonna slaughter you.
Yeah.
Yeah, but if a human tried to say that stuff, they'd hopefully be
Yeah.
in prison pretty quick.
Yeah.
I was curious, just in terms of maybe a final question. When you look at all you've been through, you've obviously been through a lot, and I'm sure we haven't touched on a lot of the parts of your story, but we've touched on enough that I get some of the picture. When you look at this, one of the questions that I think comes up for a lot of people at this point is, okay, I realize what I've escaped from. I realize the prison I was in. And now I've hit the reset button. I've done some healing, but you kind of get a chance to start over. It's like you're born again, to borrow a phrase. You're born again. Your real life starts, and you've got the blinders off now. Hopefully, at least in the biggest issues, you kind of get a chance now to talk about what your life's going to be about. Now you get, instead of people defining it for you, you get to, your life's about Christ and about the gospel, about saving people, about ministry. Now your life is about so many different other things. As you do that, and as you kind of exit the healing process, not that healing ever stops, but you kind of exit the worst of the healing process, and you get more grounded and you're more focused, less on getting over the trauma and more just living your life for the first time ever. I know that you have chosen in a totally wonderful way to take your passions, your skills, your energy, and put it towards your platform called, again, Untestimony, which we'll have the links for beneath the video. Could you just tell us and weave into it your platform, but even beyond that, what is your life all about now? What does it look like to be in your skin, to be living your life day by day? What is the rest of your life? Let's hope the best, that you've got a long life ahead of you. What is the rest of your life going to be about?
I think there's kind of been this shift from going to this like black and white, binary, dualistic thinking and way of like navigating the world to this like more colorful, nuanced view of trying to tackle everything. And that goes for everything. That goes for like critical thinking, sexuality. Just you start, as you kind of branch out into that like colorful world, you start realizing like everything is on a spectrum in a way that I never thought. I always thought there was kind of a one size fits all answer. I always thought I had all the right answers. And then once you break out of that, you can kind of like, it humbles you and it's scary, but you're seeing the world for so many more possibilities and a lot more beautiful, and it's easier to navigate because you're actually navigating, like I said, those kind of nuanced, you're paying attention to the nuance rather than just trying to fit into this bubble or this box that doesn't really portray the world correctly. So I think going forward, I don't necessarily know like how I'm going to change or grow in the future, but I think through changing like the way that I think and the way that I like address people, and by taking in the world, I feel like I'm taking in more truth than I was before and more of those colors than I was before. And that helps me navigate like even things like morality in a way more safe and effective way than I could have ever before. So I don't know what that's going to look like exactly, but I think that will help kind of like pave the way forward.
So great. I love that what you're doing. I think people need to really, go. Hopefully they went paused or interview earlier and went over to your links. But if you didn't yet, please, as we wrap up here, please do go click on the links for the whole platform, again, for Instagram and TikTok. Again, it's called Untestimony. But what you're doing there is just so amazing. And you're bringing, sometimes you bring some sarcasm, which I think is very deserved. You bring some humor. You certainly bring just some good questions, and I love how you're painting it like it's not black and white. There's a spectrum, and I remember as a Christian being told, someday in heaven you'll realize there's so many more colors, and your eyes, human eyes, couldn't see them, but there'll be a zillion other colors that God will show you. And it's like, well, that's not true, but there are a zillion other colors, and I can actually see them now. And I love that you're bringing that perspective and really helping people to escape. I mean, I don't know how much, you want this to be a platform that grows and grows and grows. I hope you do, because I think you're really good at it. But in a sense, at least for this season, there's a sense in which you're using part of your time and talents to help people escape. As I put it, you're a beggar who's found where the bread is, and you want to help other beggars to find the bread. And I commend you for that, because a lot of people, they're kind of like, I'm done with this. This really screwed me over. I'm done with all this bad stuff. And they just kind of move on, which is fine. There's nothing wrong with just moving on and being done with it all. But you've kind of taken your background where you have enough inside knowledge to be dangerous, which is great. I do too. Once you're kind of on the inside and then you leave, the secrets, the secret sauce, and you can speak to it in a way that other people can't. And in this sense, when other people are starting to question, they can go to channels like yours and see, yeah, there's some really important questions that I have never asked before. And you put them on a level that's very easy for even a certain person that's new at this to understand. But to say, wow, I mean, even just, pick any 10 of your videos about deconstruction, like those are 10 questions that I've never thought about before. And you've got a lot more than that, but just things that people really, really, really need. And I want to end by commending you for it. I thank you so much for doing it. I do hope your platform gets bigger. I hope you can just keep doing it. And I think your creativity with it is awesome. I'm bland at the moment in a sense. I'm looking to branch out as I've got more time, hopefully even this year. But I love that your stuff is very, very creative. Do you want to give to any kind of extra plugs for what we might expect from your channel in the next few months as we wrap up here?
I'm trying to get more brave to do some live streaming.
Okay.
But you'll have to stay tuned if I actually get the guts to do that or not.
That'll be awesome. Do you have any particular topics that you are gravitating to in your research?
I've been leaning a lot towards morality lately. I think it's because that affects my daily life a lot more with people's perception of atheists, and atheists being not having morals, not thinking about these things. And I kind of want to show, like, we actually do think about stuff like morality. We actually do. There are ways to kind of like think these through, and ways that Christianity doesn't necessarily make morality any more clear, but to show, just kind of get people start asking questions about those. And then I think that in a way that kind of like humanizes atheists and makes people realize, like, oh, like atheists think about this too. Like they really care. Atheists have empathy. Yeah, I think that's kind of a direction I've like seen myself going in lately.
That's awesome. I look forward to seeing that. That's so great. And I always chuckle. I'm sure you've said this as much in certain words too, but I'll say it this way, just for a final parting joke. But now that you have left a worldview that espoused genocide, land theft, slavery, genital mutilation, child brides, misogyny, patriarchy, stoning, now that you've left that, where in the world are you going to get your morality from? Come on. How will you know which group to kill? It's funny. It's amazing that the idea, and the idea too, that if that God that Christians have, if that God were suddenly not there, that like if that weren't true, that suddenly you as a Christian would turn into some kind of murderer or rapist. Like the only thing keeping you back from murdering and raping is Yahweh, and that if he were gone, you'd turn into that kind of person. Really? That's kind of scary. But
Like maybe stay a Christian. Maybe those people can stay Christian.
yeah,
It is
exactly.
all crazy how some of those concepts, like you just don't think of as a Christian. And then in hindsight, it's just like mind-boggling that you ever bought into that kind of system.
Yeah, it's so obvious. Yeah, on this side. Well, I'm so glad you escaped. Obviously, that's the big point here. I'm so glad you escaped. So glad you got out of what I call the Bible prison, and I'm so glad you're helping other people. Thank you so much again. This has been great to hear your story. I would love to do it again sometime. And everyone, please, again, click on the links. Go check out the Untestimony platform. Thank you. This has been great to get to know you, and I really, really appreciate your sharing your story today.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, let's do it again.